Hi, I'm Pastor Ben. What's going to be presented to you here is the final in our 5-part class series, Who is Jesus Christ for Us Today? The Theology of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I want to make a brief acknowledgement that I believe I made in the first class, but if not, I want to make it very clear that a lot of the work that I'm presenting here was curated by Dr. Mark Brocker, who runs the Oregon Bonhoeffer Society, and who in 2023-2024 had this same topic as the theme of that community's reading. All of the mistakes are my own, but the credit should be given to Dr. Brocker. In this series, we have looked at that question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? And in this final section, we are going to look at one of Bonhoeffer's most famous works, the book called Life Together. And in it, we're going to talk about serving and service, being a servant to one another. Recall that in this video, starting from the beginning, this letter Bonhoeffer writes at the end of his life while in prison, Who is Jesus Christ for us today, was about Christ at the center. Christ, who is the center of our current experience. We cannot limit Christ to being only at the end of days, or at the end of our days when we die, or when our human reason fails, then turn to Christ. Sure, you can do that, but for Bonhoeffer, that's not going to speak to what he calls a religionless age. That is to say, a problem they're not convinced they have, to say that then Jesus will do something about it. And what's more, why would you do that? We want to focus on where we are right now. Who is Jesus for us today? Who Jesus will be for us when we die is a different topic, and quite frankly, kind of a speculative topic. Instead, he says where we need to see Christ is in something concrete and real, right here and right now. The trouble with that is it can come up in a lot of vague ambiguity to say, well, Jesus is kind of present all the time. Well, where is Jesus actually present? Where can that be concrete? Well, one clear place, life in community, and how we live together, which is the title of the book, Life Together. There, Christ is present to one another through one another. And so his work is, where does the rubber meet the road in this question? How is Christ present? It says Christ is present specifically in community. And in order to display that, we look at the way God works in this world. How is Christ present? Well, there's a Lutheran principle that Bonhoeffer doesn't bring up, but I believe is probably behind this, of that humans are the masks of God, or in Latter Dei. And that what Martin Luther meant by that was that the works of God go through various means in this world, but one of the primary ones are people. People do the work of God. And the reason he said that they are the masks of God is that the people aren't really the ones doing the work. It's God who's doing the work. The people are just the masks. It's God. It looks like humans. These days we don't say masks of God because I think that's confusing. We tend to say being the hands and feet of Jesus. But really what it's presenting is that if that's true, then that means other people are indeed Christ to us. There and other people, when they are serving us, we are receiving grace from God, from Christ. And so where do we find Christ today? Look in the neighbor next to you. This is what Bonhoeffer wants to say. If we take this seriously, that God works through means, meaning through things, and it's not only people, but if people are a big part of it, then we have to recognize then we do see God in other people. That's where we find God. That's where Christ is for us today. Take a look at an excerpt here from Life Together. The view of such persons expands, and to their amazement, they recognize for the first time the richness of God's creative glory shining over their brothers and sisters. God did not give them to me so that I could dominate and control them, but so that I might find the Creator by means of them. What is he saying? It's out of context, so if it was a little jarring when it started, that's okay. But he's saying, when you look at people around you, and people who are very different from you, if you can see the way God is within them, then you can find the Creator. You can find God in those around you. There is Christ for you. This next piece is just continuing that same sentence. Now other people, in the freedom with which they were created, become an occasion for me to rejoice. God does not want me to mold others into whereas before they were only a nuisance and trouble for me. God does not want me to mold others into the image that seemed good to me, that is, into my own image. Instead, in their freedom from me, God made other people in God's own image. I can never know in advance how God's image should appear in others. That image always takes on a complete new and unique form whose origin is found solely in God's free and sovereign act of creation. To me, that form may seem strange, even ungodly. But God creates every person in the image of God's Son, the crucified, and this image likewise certainly looks strange and ungodly to me before I grasped it. Bonhoeffer says, there's a challenge for us, and let's take it seriously. If we're going to say we see God in others, then which others? Are you really going to be able to see that God is present in people who are very different from us? People who we would not call pious people? People who seem, as he says here, ungodly or strange? Bonhoeffer says, yes. That's the freedom of God's action in this world. God appears in ways totally unexpected, through people totally unexpected. That makes this harder than it sounds like, because I think sometimes we can get this idea, sure, you see God in other people when they're doing something nice for you. For Bonhoeffer, service isn't doing something nice for another person. It's being present, and being present in ways you might not have imagined. And the only way we're ever going to be able to do that, we're ever going to be able to say, my image of what religiosity is may not be the only image, is if I have humility in how I look at those around me. That it's not about me and my way of being. That would be seeing everyone in my own image. Instead, we're seeing this in God's own image, and God's image is expansive. And so how do we do that? How does that look in real life? Well, to do that, we have to see the other as more important than ourselves. Take a look. Just following that passage. Not considering oneself wise, but associating with the lowly means considering oneself the worst of sinners. This arouses total opposition. It sounds like an exaggeration and untruth. But if my sin appears to me to be in any way smaller or less reprehensible in comparison with the sin of others, then I am not yet recognizing my sin at all. My sin is of necessity the worst, the most serious, the most objectionable. Those who would serve others in the community must descend all the way down to this depth of humility. How could I possibly serve another person in unfeigned humility if their sins appear to me to be seriously worse than my own? Bonhoeffer's done something striking here. He said, how can I admit I can see God in another if I think I'm better than another? Instead, I must serve them. And how could I serve them if I think that I'm above them? And he frames it specifically religiously in the language of sin. And he's saying that we are all fully sinners before God. I think we're good at saying that. But that leads to, yeah, but isn't one sin more than another sin? And to be fair, in the kingdom of the left hand, in the world, then transgressions and criminal activity isn't all the same. But that's how you run a society. Bonhoeffer's not talking about that. He's talking about in the church community, whose sin before God is more offensive or less offensive. Well, there can't be any more offensive sin. It's all sin. We are all sinners, which means I am just as culpable before God as everyone else. And what's more, he follows, comes from Paul, or from, who says that I indeed am the chief or worst of all sinners. Of course, if everyone says that, that can't be true. Not everything can be worst. But he's saying this is the posture we take. We recognize that who I am and what I've done before God is what I've done before God. That's the one that's very real to me. For me, I am the worst of sinners. That gives me the right humility in order to see everyone else. Otherwise, I am in comparison. And as soon as I'm in comparison, my sin compared to your sin, then we're not in community. There's no way I could be serving another with that view. Instead, we look at it as, I'm a sinner before God. Everyone is a sinner before God. We are all the same, and thus I can serve. Then he says, how do you serve? Let's get practical. Well, he's going to have some good advice here, frankly. The first thing he says is listening. Take a look. The first service one owes to others in the community involves listening to them. So often Christians, especially preachers, think that their only service is always to have to offer something when they're together with other people. They forget that listening can be a greater service than speaking. Many people seek a sympathetic ear and do not find it among Christians, because Christians are talking even when they should be listening. But Christians who can no longer listen to one another will soon no longer be listening to God either. They will always be talking even in the presence of God. How insightful was Bonhoeffer in this? To say, people come to Christians so that they could have an opportunity to talk, and how many think they're being righteous don't listen. Instead, they talk over people, don't hear the other person, and don't provide the service they really needed, which was not for me to do something, but to listen and receive that other person. That's the first act of service. One that's not usually called service. I think Bonhoeffer's very insightful here. The second one is probably what you would think of when you say, how am I a servant to another? What he calls active helpfulness. The other service one should perform for another person in a Christian community is active helpfulness. There are many such things wherever people live together. Nobody's too good for the lowest service. Those who worry about the loss of time entailed by such small external acts of helpfulness are usually taking their work too seriously. We must be ready to allow ourselves to be interrupted by God. Here, his little section talking about that is probably what most of us think about serving other people, of how do we help each other? And often it's not big things, it's the small things. The small things you can recognize in community, but you might not recognize for a stranger. And he says, really, the problem of this not happening all the time is us thinking of ourselves too important, our work too important, ourselves too important, We can all do this at all times. I won't dwell on this because I think that's probably what most of you think about when you think about service. But then he says, really, when it all boils down, it leads to something more significant yet. That real service isn't just listening, isn't just active helpfulness, but it really is bearing one another's burdens. That's real community. Take a look. Christians must bear the burden of one another. They must suffer and endure one another. Only as a burden is the other really a brother or sister and not just an object to be controlled. Bearing the burden of the other means tolerating the reality of the other's creation by God, affirming it, and in bearing with it, breaking through to delight in it. It's almost like his first point about service. You can't see God only in those who look like you. But instead, if you're going to be in community and bear the burden of another, you really have to do that. You really have to bear their burden, and only then are you really in community. Before then, you're in space together. You might be helping each other. But when we accompany each other in the suffering and pain and struggle, there we discover we're really in community after all. It's easy to be community when everything's going well. But how do you do it when people are hurting? When there are those who need help? When you yourself need help? No one's better than one another. Here, the challenge of that is, once again, you have to do that for the ones who don't look like you, who have issues you don't have. And that's exactly the point. Then we see God's creation within this community. And then he looks, that's how you really are community together. That's where you see God in one another, when burdens are borne. And then he leads to maybe the most significant element of all. So where does that work for you? You, the reader of this book, you, the hearer of this video, how does that work? Because I'm going to assume a lot of you watching this video are from a faith tradition who do have a strong act of service to one another. And so frequently in Protestantism, that is the focus. How do I serve those around me? I've been charged to, I've been called to. How do I do it? Real grace, for Bonhoeffer, includes that. But it's usually not that that's the stumbling block. The stumbling block is the inverse. Can I have the grace to receive grace from another? Can I have the humility to receive it from another? Here he says toward the end of this section of Life Together, the more we learn to allow the other to speak the word to us, to accept humbly and gratefully even severe reproaches and admonitions, the more free and to the point we ourselves will be in speaking, and especially in community with God. This isn't about who I am to all of you others. That's seeing myself above all of you. This is also you being in community with me. Bonhoeffer's theology, if you only look at what he says, say, in discipleship, the first half, it can sound really individual, almost like Kierkegaard's idea of religion before God, of a person individually finally leaning up to and ascending to a new kind of spirituality. But here is the corrective. It is not about an individual. It is about the community together. Where is Jesus Christ for you today? Can you see it in another person? More than anything, can you see it in community? The concrete, real church community that are among you, which includes all the failings of those around you, but also all the graces. And you can do that because we embrace all the failings of myself and the joys of myself. The law, the gospel, the grace, the challenges. That's where Jesus Christ resides among us all. This series has been called, Who is Jesus Christ for Us Today? If you've missed the previous ones, I encourage you to go back and take a look. This is the first series we've done to the camera so that it would have a digital presence. If this series was helpful for you, let us know. If there's things you can encourage, that we could change to make it a little better, let us know. Contact me, Pastor Ben, at welcometocentral.org. Thanks for watching.